We come to chapter 12, whereby the reader will be enabled to trace the further course of Miss Fanny Squeers' love for Nicholas, and to ascertain whether it ran smooth or otherwise. Just a word of explanation. The expression "in his cups" simply means that someone is drunk. It was a fortunate circumstance for Miss Fanny Squeers that when her worthy papa returned home on the night of the small tea party, he was what the initiated term too far gone to observe the numerous tokens of extreme vexation of spirit which were plainly visible in her countenance. Being, however, of a rather violent and quarrelsome mood when in his cups, it is not possible that he might have fallen out with her either on this or some imaginary topic, if the young lady had not, with a foresight and prudence highly commendable, kept a boy up on purpose to bear the first brunt of the good gentleman's anger, which, having vented itself in a variety of kicks and cuffs, subsided sufficiently to admit of his being persuaded to go to bed, which he did with his boots on and an umbrella under his arm. The hungry servant attended Miss Squeers in her own room according to custom to curl her hair, perform the other little offices of her toilet, and administer as much flattery as she could get up for the purpose, for Miss Squeers was quite lazy enough and sufficiently vain and frivolous withal to have been a fine lady, and it was only the arbitrary distinctions of rank and station which prevented her from being one.
"How lovely your hair do curl tonight, miss,"
said the handmaiden.
"I do declare if it's a pity and a shame to brush it out." "Hold your tongue,"
replied Miss Squeers wrathfully. Some considerable experience prevented the girl from being at all surprised at any outbreak of ill temper on the part of Miss Squeers. Having a half perception of what had happened in the course of the evening, she changed her mode of making herself agreeable and proceeded on the indirect tack.
"Well, I couldn't help saying, miss, if you was to kill me for it," said the attendant, "that I never seen nobody look so vulgar as Miss Price did tonight."
Miss Squeers sighed and composed herself to listen.
"I know it's very wrong of me to say so, miss," continued the girl, delighted to see the impression she was making, "but Miss Price, being friend of yourn and all, she do dress herself out so and go on in such a manner to get noticed, and, well, if only people saw themselves." "What do you mean, Fib?"
asked Miss Squeers, looking in her own little glass, where, like most of us, she saw not herself, but the reflection of some pleasant image in her own brain.
"Oh, you do talk." "Talk, miss! It's enough to make a tom-cat talk French grammar, only to see how she tosses her head," replied the handmaid. "Aye, she does toss her head," observed Miss Squeers, with an air of abstraction. "So vain, so very, very, very plain," said the girl. "Poor Tilda!"
sighed Miss Squeers compassionately.
And always laying herself out to go so, to get admired, pursued the servant. Oh dear, it's positively indelicate. I can't allow you to talk in that way, Fib, said Miss Squeers. Tilda's friends are low people, and if she don't know any better, it's their fault and not hers. Well, but you know, miss, said Phoebe, which name Fib was used as a patronising abbreviation. If she was only to take copy of a friend, if only she knew how wrong it was and would set herself right by you, what a nice young woman she might be in time. Fib, rejoined Miss Squeers in a stately air, it's not proper for me to hear these comparisons drawn. They make Tilda look like someone of coarse and improper person, and it seems unfriendly in me to listen to them. I would rather you drop the subject, Fib. At the same time, I must say that if Tilda Price would take pattern by somebody, not me particularly. Oh, yes, you, miss, interposed Fib. Well, Fib, if you will have it so, said Miss Squeers, I must say that if she would be all the better for it. So somebody else thinks, or I'm very much mistaken, said the girl mysteriously. What do you mean? Demanded Miss Squeers. Never mind, miss, replied the girl. I know what I know, that's all. Fib, said Miss Squeers dramatically, I insist upon you explaining yourself. What is this dark mystery? Speak! Why, if you will have it so, miss, it's this, said the servant girl. Mr. John Browdie thinks as you think, and if he wasn't too far gone to do it creditable, he'd be very glad to be off with Miss Price and on with Miss Squeers. Gracious heavens! exclaimed Miss Squeers, clasping her hands with great dignity. What is this? Truth, ma'am, and nothing but truth, replied the artful Fib. What a situation! cried Miss Squeers, on the brink of unconsciously destroying the peace and happiness of her friend. What is the reason that men fall in love with me, whether I like it or not, and desert their chosen intendeds for my sake? Why do they do it? Because they can't help it, miss, replied the girl. The reason's very plain.
If Miss Squeers were the reason, it certainly was very plain.
Never let me hear of you speak of it again, retorted Miss Squeers. Never, never, do you hear? Tilda Price has faults, many faults, but I wish her well, and above all I wish her married, for I think it highly desirable, most desirable, from the very nature of her failings, that she should be married as soon as possible. No, Fib, let her have Mr. Browdie. I may pity him, poor fellow, but I have a great regard for Tilda, and only hope she may make a better wife than I think she will.
With this effusion of feeling, Miss Squeers went to bed. Next morning, this happy state of mind had some influence in bringing about a reconciliation between Miss Squeers and Miss Price. For when a knock came at the front door, and the miller's daughter was announced, Miss Squeers betook herself in the parlour in a Christian frame of spirit perfectly beautiful to behold.
Well, Fanny, said the miller's daughter. "You see, I've come to see you. I know we had some words last night." "I pity your bad passions, Tilda," replied Miss Squeers, "but I bear no malice. I am above it." "Don't be cross, Fanny," said Miss Price. "I've come to tell you something that I know will please you." "What may that be, Tilda?" demanded Miss Squeers, screwing up her lips and looking as if nothing in earth, air, fire, or water could afford her the slightest gleam of satisfaction. "This," rejoined Miss Price. "After we were left here last night, John and I had a dreadful quarrel." "That does not please me," said Miss Squeers, relaxing a smile, though. "Law, I wouldn't think so bad of you as you suppose if it did," rejoined her companion. "That's not it." "Oh," said Miss Squeers, relapsing into melancholy. "Go on." "After a great deal of wrangling and saying we would never see each other no more," continued Miss Price, "we made it up, and this morning John went and wrote down our names to be put up for the first time next Sunday. So we shall be married in 3 weeks, and I give you the notice to get your frock made."
There was mingled gall and honey in this intelligence. The prospect of the friends being married so soon was the gall, and the certainty of her not entertaining serious designs upon Nicholas was the honey. Upon the whole, the sweet overcame the bitter. So Miss Squeers said she would get the frock made, and that she hoped Tilda might be happy, though at the same time she didn't know, and would not have had her build too much upon it, for men were strange creatures, and a great many married women were very miserable, and wished themselves single again with all their hearts. To which condolences Miss Squeers added others equally calculated to raise her friend's spirits and promote her cheerfulness of mind.
"But come now, Fanny," said Miss Price, "I want to have a word or two with you about young Mr. Nickleby." "He's nothing to me," interrupted Miss Squeers with hysterical symptoms. "I despise him." "Oh, you don't mean that, I'm sure," replied her friend. "Confess, Fanny, don't you like him now?"
Without returning any direct reply, Miss Squeers all at once fell into a paroxysm of spiteful tears, and exclaimed that he was a wretched, neglected, miserable castaway.
"I hate everybody," said Miss Squeers, "and I wish that everybody was dead, that I do."
"Dear, dear," said Miss Price, quite moved by this avowal of misanthropic sentiments.
"You are not serious, I am sure." "Yes, I am," returned Miss Squeers, tying tight knots in her pocket handkerchief and clenching her teeth. "And I wish I was dead too. There."
"Oh, you'll think differently in another 5 minutes," said Matilda. "How much better to take him into favour again than hurt yourself by going on in that way. Wouldn't it be much nicer now to have him all to yourself on good terms, in a nice company-keeping, love-making, pleasant sort of manner?"
"I don't know but that it would,"
sobbed Miss Squeers.
"Oh, Tilda, how could you have acted so mean and dishonourable last evening? I wouldn't have believed it of you if anybody had told me."
"Heyday!" exclaimed Miss Price, giggling.
"One would suppose that I'd been murdering someone at last." "Very nigh as bad," said Miss Squeers passionately. "And all this because I happen to have enough good looks to make people civil to me,"
cried Miss Price.
"Persons don't make up their own faces, and it's no more my fault if mine is a good one, better than other people's fault if theirs is a bad one." "Hold your tongue!" shrieked Miss Squeers in her shrillest tone, "or you'll make me slap you, Tilda, and afterwards I should be sorry for it."
It is needless to say that by this time the temper of each young lady was in some slight degree affected by the tone of her conversation, and that with a dash of personality was infused into the altercation in consequence. Indeed, the quarrel, from slight beginnings, rose to a considerable height, and was assuming a very violent complexion, when both parties, falling into a great passion of tears, exclaimed simultaneously that they had never thought of being spoken to in that way, without which exclamation, leading to a remonstrance, gradually brought about an explanation, and the upshot was that they fell into each other's arms and vowed eternal friendship. The occasion in question making the 52nd time of repeating the same impressive ceremony within a 12-month. Soon it was time for Miss Price to return home. Miss Squeers said in high good humour that she would walk part of the way with her for the pleasure of her company, and off they went together. It happened that that particular time, comprising the short daily interval which was suffered to elapse between what was pleasantly called the dinner of Mr. Squeers' pupils and their return to the pursuit of useful knowledge, was precisely the hour when Nicholas was accustomed to issue forth for a melancholy walk, and to brood as he sauntered listlessly through the village upon his miserable lot. Miss Squeers knew this perfectly well, but had perhaps forgotten it, for when she caught sight of that young gentleman advancing towards them, she evinced many symptoms of surprise and consternation, and assured her friend that she felt
fit to drop into the earth.
"Shall we turn back or run into a cottage?" asked Miss Price.
"He don't see us yet."
"No, Tilda, no," replied Miss Squeers.
"It is my duty to go through with it, and I will."
As Miss Squeers said this, in the tone of one who has made a high moral resolution, and was besides taken with one or two chokes and catchings of breath, indicative of feelings at a high pressure, her friend made no further remark, and they bore straight down upon Nicholas, who was walking with his eyes bent upon the ground, not aware of their approach until they were close upon him. Otherwise he might perhaps have taken shelter himself. "Good morning," said Nicholas, bowing and passing by.
"He is going,"
murmured Miss Squeers.
"I shall choke, Tilda." "Come back, Mr. Nickleby, do,"
cried Miss Price, affecting alarm at her friend's threat, but really actuated by a malicious wish to hear what Nicholas would say.
"Come back, Mr. Nickleby."
Mr. Nickleby came back, and looked as confused as might be, as he inquired whether the ladies had any commands for him.
"Don't stop to talk," urged Miss Price hastily, "but support her on the other side. How do you feel now, dear?"
"Oh, better," sighed Miss Squeers, laying a beaver bonnet of a reddish brown with a green veil attached on Mr. Nickleby's shoulder.
"This foolish faintness." "Don't call it foolish, dear,"
said Miss Price, her bright eye dancing with merriment, as she saw perplexity in Nicholas's eye.
"You have no reason to be ashamed of it. It's those who are too proud to come round again without all this to do that ought to be ashamed.
I see you are resolved to fix it upon me, said Nicholas, smiling, although I told you last night it was not my fault.
There, he says it was not his fault, my dear, remarked the wicked Miss Price. Perhaps you were too jealous or too hasty with him. He says it's not his fault, you hear? I think that's apology enough.
You will not understand me, said Nicholas. Pray dispense with this jesting, for I have no time and really no inclination to be the subject of or promoter of mirth just now.
What do you mean? asked Miss Price, affecting amazement. Don't ask him, cried Miss Squeers. I forgive him.
Dear me, said Nicholas, as the brown bonnet went down again on his shoulder. This is a more serious matter than I had supposed. Allow me, will you have the goodness to hear me speak? Here he raised up the brown bonnet, and regarding with most unfeigned astonishment a look of tender reproach from Miss Squeers, shrunk back a few paces to be out of the reach of the fair burden, and went on to say, I'm very sorry, truly, and sincerely sorry for having been the cause of any difference among you last night. I reproach myself most bitterly for having been so unfortunate as to cause dissension, although I did so, I assure you, most unwittingly and heedlessly.
Well, that's not all you've got to say, surely, exclaimed Miss Price, as Nicholas paused.
I fear there is something more, stammered Nicholas with half a smile, and looking towards Miss Squeers. It is a most awkward thing to say, but the very mention of such a supposition makes one look like a puppy. Still, may I ask you if this lady supposes that I entertain any... In short, does she think that I am in love with her?
Delightful embarrassment, thought Miss Squeers. I have brought him to it at last. Answer for me, dear, she whispered to her friend. Does she think so? Rejoined Miss Price. Of course she does.
She does? Exclaimed Nicholas with energy of utterance, just as much as might have been for the moment mistaken for rapture.
Certainly, replied Miss Price. If Mr. Nickleby has doubted that, Tilda, said the blushing Miss Squeers in soft accents, he may set his mind at rest. His sentiments are reciprocal.
Stop! cried Nicholas hurriedly. Pray hear me. This is the grossest and wildest delusion, the completest and most signal mistake that ever human being laboured under or committed. I have scarcely seen the young lady half a dozen times, but if I had seen her 60 times, or am desired to see her 60,000, it would be and will be precisely the same. I have not one thought, wish, or hope connected with her, unless it be, and I say this not to hurt her feelings, but to impress upon her the real state of my own, unless it be the one object dear to my own heart as life itself, of being one day able to turn my back upon this accursed place, never to set foot in it again, or even think of it, but with loathing and disgust. With this particularly plain and straightforward declaration, which he made with all the vehemence that his indignant and excited feelings could bring to bear upon it, Nicholas, waiting to hear no more, retreated. Poor Miss Squeers! Her anger, rage, and vexation, the rapid succession of bitter and passionate feelings that whirled through her mind are not to be described. Refused. Refused by a teacher, picked up by advertisement at an annual salary of £5, payable at indefinite periods, and found in food and lodging like the very boys themselves, and this too in the presence of a little chit of a miller's daughter of 18, who was going to be married in 3 weeks' time to a man who had gone down on his very knees to ask her. She could have choked in right good earnest of being so humbled.
"Let him see,"
said the irritated young lady to herself when she regained her own room.
"Let him see if I don't set mother against him a little more when she comes back."
It was scarcely necessary to do this, but Miss Squeers was as good as her word, and poor Nicholas, in addition to bad food, dirty lodging, and being compelled to witness one dull, unwearying round of squalid misery, was treated with every special indignity that malice could suggest or most grasping cupidity could put upon him. Not was that all. There was another and deeper system of annoyance which made his heart sink and nearly drove him wild by its injustice and cruelty. The wretched creature Smike, since the night Nicholas had spoken kindly to him in the schoolroom, had followed him to and fro with an ever restless desire to serve or help him, anticipating such little wants as his humble ability could supply, and content only to be near him. He would sit beside him for hours, looking patiently into his face, and a word would brighten up his careworn visage and call into it a passing gleam even of happiness. He was an altered being. He had an object now, and that object was to show his attachment to the only person, and that person a stranger, who treated him not to say with kindness, but like a human being. Upon this poor creature, all the spleen and ill humour that could not be vented upon Nicholas were unceasingly bestowed. Drudgery would have been nothing. Smike was well used to it. Buffetings inflicted without cause would have been equally a matter of course, for to them also he had served a long and weary apprenticeship. But it was no sooner observed that he had become attached to Nicholas than stripes and blows, morning, night, and noon, were his only portion. Squeers was jealous of the influence which his assistant had so soon acquired, and his family hated him, and Smike paid for both. Nicholas saw it, and ground his teeth at every repetition of the savage and cowardly attack. He had arranged a few regular lessons for the boys, and one night, as he paced up and down, walking in the dismal schoolroom, his swollen heart almost burst to thinking that his protection and countenance should have increased the misery of that wretched being whose peculiar destitution had awakened his pity. He paused mechanically in the dark corner where sat the object of his thoughts. The poor soul was poring hard over a tattered book, with the traces of recent tears still upon his face, vainly endeavouring to matter some task which a child of 8 or 9 years old, possessed of ordinary powers, could have conquered with ease, but which to the addled brain of the crushed boy of 19 was a sealed and hopeless mystery. Yet there he sat, patiently conning the page again and again, stimulated by no boyish ambition, for he was the common jest and scoff even of the uncouth objects that congregated about him, but inspired by the one eager desire to please his solitary friend, Nicholas laid his hand upon his shoulder. I can't do it, said the dejected creature, looking up with bitter disappointment in every feature. No. Do not try, replied Nicholas. The boy shook his head and, closing the book with a sigh, looked vacantly round and laid his head upon his arm. He was weeping. Do not go on, for God's sake, said Nicholas in an agitated voice. I cannot bear to see you. They are more hard with me than ever, sobbed the boy. I know it, rejoined Nicholas, they are. But for you, said the outcast, I should die. They would kill me. They would. I know they would. You will do better, poor fellow, replied Nicholas, shaking his head mournfully, when I am gone. Gone! cried the other, looking intently in his face. Softly, rejoined Nicholas. Yes. Are you going? demanded the boy in an earnest whisper. I cannot say, replied Nicholas. I was speaking more of my own thoughts than to you. Tell me, said the boy imploringly. Oh, do tell me. Will you go? Will you? I shall be driven to it at last, said Nicholas. The world is before me, after all. Tell me, urged Smike, is the world as bad and dismal as this place? Heaven forbid, replied Nicholas, pursuing the train of his own thoughts. Its hardest, coarsest toil were happiness to this. Should I ever meet you there? demanded the boy, speaking with unusual wildness and volubility. Yes, replied Nicholas, willing to soothe him. No, said the other, clasping him by the hand. Should I? Tell me that again. Say how I should be sure to find you. You would, replied Nicholas, with the same humane intention. And I would help and aid you, not bring fresh sorrow upon you, as I have done here. The boy caught the young man's hands passionately to his, and hugging them to his breast, uttered a few broken sounds that were unintelligible. Squeers entered at that moment, and he shrank back into his old corner.